Dear colleagues, dear country officials, and dear social protection practitioners, scholars, and academics, thank you very much for your time getting the invitation from ADB coming to the APSP week and for this special session on how to finance social protection that is very, very fundamental and important, backing up all the running of the system and benefiting people. Here, I have the opportunity and honor to moderate this session. I would like to briefly introduce our speakers and resource persons, as well as our important conclusion notes giver. So firstly, at my left side, it is Mr. Andrea Rossi, who is the regional advisor on social policy and economic analysis in East Asia and Pacific Regional Office at the UNICEF. So he will present the main issues and takeaways from UNICEF's regional budget analysis of social spending in Asia and the Pacific. Here is Mr. Herwig Immervoll, who is the head of the Employment-Oriented Social Policies Directorate for Employment, Labor, and Social Affairs at the OECD. He will bring the experience in OECD maintaining fiscal space for social protection, example of earmarking and committed forms of financing. We have also our two ladies, like they are representing our member countries. One is Ms. Parbati Arya, who is the Joint Secretary of the Economic Policy Analysis Division, Ministry of Labor, Employment, and Social Security at the Nepal. And another lady is Ms. Sinta Sachana, who is the Social Protection Specialist at the Partnerships for Social Protection for the, from the Australian Agency on analyzing the social protection expenditure in Pacific Island countries and Timor-Leste. Yeah, our DG from the Climate Change and Sustainable Development Department, Mr. Bruno Carrasco, will be the one giving the important conclusion remarks. But before that, we will give time for our audiences bringing up the questions and from the panel to give answers. I think we can somehow, we can already kick off. So, Mr. Andrea Rossi, yeah, I understand that there has already been a very significant trend for the Asia and Pacific countries to increase the expenditures in the social protection from the different channels. But your focus will be mostly on tax-financed social protection schemes, right? So that will really represent how the country governments are committed from their own resources on social protection. Thank you very much for sharing this with us. Yes, it is here.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks so much to everybody to be in this panel. I will try to present some reflection from the experience of UNICEF in the region. And I start with this picture. I only realized when I was doing the presentation it actually really matched the logo of this conference, with the difference is that the child is actually outside the umbrella. And you have somebody who is under a house, somebody is under an umbrella, and somebody is out. And this is actually a nice representation what always happens sometimes in our social protection systems. Next one, please. So, as for the title of this panel, definitely we know that, and we heard this morning, the increase of demand for social protection is outstanding. If you look at just the case of poverty, and particularly child poverty, what we are experiencing since the last 2 years is something that never happened in the region for the last 30 years. East Asia and Pacific was the region with the most outstanding decrease in poverty in the last 30 years, 40 years, the rapid one, and for the first time we have seen poverty going up. Something that none of the governments, none probably of all the people there are in the government at the moment ever experienced. And the other important thing is that the crisis that we are facing, the crisis that we faced in the last 2 years, the impact will continue for the next years. And that is something critical. It's not just about the job that have been lost or the business that have been lost and now is recuperating. It's the fact that the impact that we had, particularly if you think about children, on the loss of years of education, of the loss of health, and the impact on mental health of this new generation will have a monetary impact in the future that still we haven't calculated properly. Next one. The second one, we heard very well, the region, the climate change, the changes, the cost of the natural hazard that we will have in the region will probably exceed the total amount of government spending in several countries. And those are costs that at the end goes on household, that goes on everybody, on all people, particularly the poor one. And again, if you look at the increased demand, next one please, is something that we heard last time. We had the last conference here, and sometimes we forget. But the dramatic change that we are having in terms of demographic in the region is as big as the climate change. What we have seen is the rapid decrease in fertility rate in countries in the region, from China to Thailand, is something that 3-4 years ago was not expected. I just give you some ideas. In the past, we talk about demographic dividend, and we have this kind of optimistic view. For our region, not only we are not in the demographic dividend, we are moving back from aging society to aged society. And aged society is when the proportion of elder people is much beyond the young one. Now, if you just look at the graph on the left, without all the details, just to give the severity of the problem in the region. In France, it took 175 years to move from aging society to aged society. In Vietnam, it's only 19 years. And in Thailand, it's only 22. That means the countries are getting old before getting rich. And that's for social protection, for financing social protection, is a fundamental problem. The reason is because not only we have decreasing birth rate, but also we have an increase of life expectancy for elders. That by itself is a good news, by the way. We are all coming on that moment of life. But that means that the dependency ratios, that means the number of people will be able to produce and pay and generate income for their pension is getting smaller. And the number of people that will need a pension in the future is getting bigger. Now, we have discussed about that one when we look about pension and social protection pension. I'm from UNICEF, and I'm here to tell you that when we look at the pension is the cost. But in this room, we are talking about financing. And financing means the people who finance those pensions are the 5 years old that are now out of schools. Your pension, or the majority of the people in this room, will be paid by the people that are 5 or 6 years old now. And they will need to pay the pension for more than 40% that you or the young people are paying now. So the investment that we need to make, making sure that we don't lose a single child in this region, is for yourself. It's not just because I'm UNICEF, I'm thinking about that, but it's a fundamental issue. If you don't decrease the exclusion, if we don't increase the capacity to be invested and to have a good human capital, there will be no resources to pay the pension in the future. Next one. And the third one, as we heard today, even at the first presentation, is also understanding that the problem and the needs in the region are much more dynamic than we are supposed to think in the past. In the past, we were thinking about poor are poor, like you are blonde hair or blue eyes, and you are poor, like a standard label that you get and you stay there for probably almost your life. And this is why we're doing household budget survey every 5 years or every 7 years. We thought it was enough to identify who are the poor. Now poor people go in and out of poverty very quickly. We have seen what happened in the last 2-3 years. And it's not just COVID, it was a macro event, but also the other events that are happening, climate change, other different economic crises, and so on, make people fluctuating between different level of poverty, different level of status very quickly. And they need to have a response with that level of dynamics. Now, do we have a system, a financial system, that is able to mobilize the resources with that level of dynamics? This is one of the key elements. Also because the dynamics we are seeing is moving our normal comfort zone. We were supposed to think about that the poor are in rural areas, they are uneducated. Well, now what we are seeing is that more and more extreme poverty is happening in urban areas. Extreme poverty is happening very dynamically, and people can fall and come back. Well, fall very easily and not so very easily coming back. Next one. So what I want to present here is a work that we have done for the last 2 years and we continue to do. So it's not just a publication itself, but it's a continuation of the work that UNICEF has done now for more than 10, 15 years. It is looking at the public finance of social sectors. Always people think about why UNICEF is working on public finance. Well, we work with children, but working with children means we work with education, health, and social protection. That means almost 3/4 of social budget you can think about in a country. And we work within those governments. And we do understand not only about the importance of looking how the dynamics of the allocation, but also how the expenditure, how the money is spent with those sectors. So what we call the budget briefs or the budget analysis is something we do in most of the countries. So we wanted to look at what happened at regional level, how the region is working. And so we look at trends in education, health, and social assistance, particularly looking at the response of the major crisis that was COVID. Next one. So to understand that one, this is a kind of a picture that for me, you have to think about like planets. They look like planets, right, or bubbles. In reality, what you have here is, on your right side, is the size of GDP of this region. The blue one is the size of national budget. The green one is the size of ODA. And the blue, small blue on the left, and you should put a magnifier, is all the money that the UN have. So here, in this region, who really makes a difference are government budget. This is the size is 1 to 1,000. Governments in the region take, for the governments in the region to mobilize the same amount of money or the entire ODA, they take 1 day of revenues, 1 day per year. This is how relevant the cooperation is in terms of the money. So the real financing is coming from governments, even the poorest one. The large amount of resources for social protection is government one. And we need to work together to influence and to maximize those resources, not just our intervention. Next one. So if you look at social protection, what we can do for the finance that we have seen so increase in need? Well, there are the usual 5 options. So the first one is, can we look at development, the overseas development assistance or aid and debt relief? Yes, but you have seen is minuscule. Doesn't really make a real amount. Can we go on deficit financing through domestic and external borrowing? This is what we have done in the last 2 years. And now we know that is a growing problem of debt that we didn't have in the past, and now is getting serious, not as in the other part of the world, but also is getting serious for this part of for East Asian Pacific. Third option, so how we can increase the cake, how we can increase that blue bubble that we have seen before is through domestic revenue mobilization. And then the idea is to improve tax and increase tax and tax policy reform. We know this is difficult to make this argument, particularly after recession. Nobody wants to increase taxes when companies are just coming out. But still, this region, the level of taxation of this region, as we've seen this morning, is very low compared with other parts. And if it is low, there is a space. But we know that it's not the moment, maybe. So what are the real options we have now? Probably are 2. The first one is to work on prioritization in budget allocation. That means deciding how we cut the cake. And the second one is to increase the efficiency of PFM in each of the sectoral sectors. It's something that sometimes we don't look at, but is, despite looking only at the allocation to the sector, is to see how the sectors are using the money, how the sectors, when they reach the Ministry of Education, are properly used for this conference. When the money reaches the Minister of Social Affairs or the Minister in charge of social protection, how those money are used. What is the level of efficiency of results of the resources achieved? So at the end, because what we are asking, as we have seen before, we have to do more, probably with less. Next one. So there are a few lessons that we learned from COVID, and I think this is, for me, is my favorite one, is that during the COVID, the COVID emergency challenged some of the usual hidden assumptions that we had about public finances, state response on social protection. The first one was about speed. Governments cannot react immediately because the bureaucracy is too slow, what I call the bureaucratic assumption. Well, actually what happened during the COVID, that governments were able to start implementing vertical and horizontal programs within 40 days by the first case. In some countries like Mongolia, it was even negative because they started having intervention even before they had a case, to show that when there is a will, the government can be very fast. The second was on the size. There is a capacity assumption. Government don't have the capacity to quickly expand. They have a problem with being a bureaucracy. Not true. We had an expansion of 47% within the first year of the emergency. And finance. I remember before COVID going around meeting with different Ministry of Finances and always talking about social protection, child grant, different intervention. And always the answer was, yes, UNICEF, that's a great idea. Unfortunately, there is no fiscal space. Then COVID came, and the fiscal space were found in less than a month. And trillions of money were mobilized for multiple reasons. Now, we know there are differences, right? We know there are reasons for that. But that, I think, was an important experience to show that state and national system are able to mobilize resources to a scale, a speed, and at a level that was never experienced before. Next one. We also know, and this is I quote a person from a government from one of the country in this region, that he say a year ago, Andrea, the rich now are better, consolidation is coming. And that was true. As soon the emergency finished for part of the population, then consolidation started. And the shift of the resources that was dedicated to social intervention, particularly social protection at the beginning, will start moving somewhere else. And we know that. And it's not a surprise. We knew since the beginning. I remember in early 2020 when we saw the first creation of intervention, we knew they were not permanent. And we have to understand that things are not permanent. But we want to make sure that that experience doesn't bring back where we were before. Next one. So what we have done, and we're going to the things I would like to present now, is to look in the mapping of the priority of track. I like a quote from Schumpeter that says the budget is the skeleton of institutional priorities stripped of all misleading narrative. That means if you really want to understand what a priority is, look at the budget. Don't read the strategy paper or the advocacy things. And this is what we have done. And we wanted to look at, particularly in the 2 years over the COVID, what happened? What government did it really on education, social protection, and health? And the idea we defined 4 possible areas. Resilient countries that increase the priority over the 2 years. And here we look at budget as a proportion, sectoral budget as a proportion of the national budget, not as a proportion of GDP, as a national budget to monitor what is the priority. So we have those kind of options. And I showed the results. And we are still ongoing. I showed the first 2 years, and now we are collecting data for the last 2 Next one. For example, on health, what we have seen is that in the 2 years, there was in most of the countries, of course, this is a continuation of increase between the first year, so 1920, and also the second year, 2021. So just to understand that graph, all the dots on the right side of the diagonal, it means there's a net increase. And all the dots under the diagonal, it means they were worse than before, so the priority decreased. And how you can see in health, there was an increase. So the increase as a priority, I'm talking about as a priority, is a political analysis here more than financial one. And of course, there will be some problems, right? It was increased because of the COVID. Some areas suffered. For example, the number of children with a 0-dose vaccine, that means they haven't been vaccinated for the routine vaccination, increased during this year, during these 2 years. But overall,
5 minutes left.
Overall, there was an increase. Next one. On social protection, it was interesting because social protection was volatile. As you can see here, mainly they are on the lower right quadrant, that means the average. That means there has been an increase in the first part and then a decrease in the second year. And this is what you have seen in different areas. The third one, next one, but what was unexpected is that we discovered in education, there was a decrease in education the first year on average and then a decrease in the second one. So the priority of education went down during the emergency. Next one. And so before this one, what is important is that in reality, the other result you are looking at the end of these changes is a zero sum. So what you have seen is that the increase in one area is done against the decrease in other social areas. So we have to be very careful when we analyze financing for social protection that we cannot assess financing for social protection outside the assessment of the other social sectors. Because if you increase the cash that we give to children, to families, but we decrease the investment in health and education, the net benefit for the household will go down. And here it's important that we remember that. Social services is part of the transfer that we are doing in a country. If we shift money from one sector to the other, it looks good if you're working on social protection, but it looks bad when you look at the impact on the household. And the second one, when you look at the financing, now that just to run to the conclusion, is that if we really want to have a system, a financial system that is able to adapt to that environment that I mentioned before, so a dynamic environment of multiple crises, we need to have a system that is able to identify, mobilize, channel, and distribute money in a moment that is not always the same. So that has go through different levels. It's like, imagine this is a system of pipes and water. There are moments where you need a lot of water, and the moment where you need less water. You don't have to focus only on how much water you pour into the system. You also have to design the system with the proper pipes that are able to adjust to the pressure. It's a stupid example, but it's important to understand that we cannot create big systems that we will not use. That will be inefficient. We need to create systems that are able to absorb the pressure. Now, this means working inside the social protection system, the inside public finance system, understanding that first, we need to have those additional money, where those additional money are coming from. And the second is how those additional money are able to channel. Another work we are doing at the moment, we look at the relation between the increase of funds in the last 3 years in social protection, but the stagnant number of people working in social protection. The number of people, individual social protection officers that have to handle cases, triplicate in some countries. And we can add all the innovative technology, digitalization we want, but still that's a problem. The quality of the service goes down dramatically if you don't have a system that is able to absorb that pressure. Next one.
2 minutes.
So the important is to think about the system and also to think about where those money are coming from. And in that one, the option is much bigger. We really have to learn a lot about what on the idea of disaster risk financing, or what is risk financing. Understanding that risk financing should be part of our system, that for the non-contributory system, most of the time is based on budget allocation. So standard budget you receive at the beginning of the year. And now here we have to create a system that we go into risk transfer, risk retention, different kind of modalities, and understand you have an architecture of resources that is able to mobilize funds at the right moment, because in the future, these needs will be increased. Next one. So what is the fiscal space to finish? Here. Well, first, I hope it is very clear that fiscal space is more than anything a political choice. It's interesting how sometimes when we come with new needs, like for children or for climate change or poverty, the first answer from Minister of Finance is always like, where is the fiscal space? But not always the same. Just think about, in this moment, all the countries in the world are moving to spend 2% of their GDP in armament. Nobody's asking where is the fiscal space. Nobody's asking what is the efficiency of that level. Every fiscal decision, financial decision, is a political decision. And this is very important. In social protection, is technical. It has to be technically handled, but it has to be a political decision, because new challenges requires new priorities. And social protection is a key component of the future for our region, but it's not the only one. This is important. Understanding the financing of social protection as a part of the financing of the people in need of the country is essential. Otherwise, it's like a three-cup game, right? And we end up thinking that we got more when in reality for people there is less. Next one, and I finish with this picture. I just came back from Finland when we took some mayors for working on child-friendly cities. And this is a picture that you have in kindergarten in Finland when they send kids to play even when outside is -25. And the answer was, yes, of course they can play, just give them more clothes. Well, this is the same. I think that children have the rights they don't have to change their rights. The only things we need to have is to improve the policy we make. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rossi. So a quick takeaway from what you said is that there should be priority track, for making decision, and there shall ensure this responsiveness to any risks, and also the selection must be very, very targeted. So now we come to our OECD expert, Mr. Imovol, on his speech So we may hope to learn from OECD countries' experience, but they all show various experience and allocations, and also emerging method of financing SP. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Chair. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So I will be taking up this topic of fiscal space for social protection in OECD countries. As you will see, that is an important topic also in OECD countries. It's important because there's very significant resources devoted to social protection. It's also important to look back into the past, how were countries able to sustain this level of spending, but also to look into the future. There are fiscal pressures that are quite substantial, both on the revenue side. So if you look at things like population aging, for instance, but also on the side of the needs for social support, including through the green transition, for example. Next slide, please. So I will pick it up, and thank you, Andrea, for showing the slide with the big blue bubble. So in a sense, one can think of domestic resource mobilization, or sort of the public finance conundrum for social protection. One can think of that in different ways. One is to make the pie bigger, whether that's through growth or through economic growth, or through increasing the tax base, tackling informality, or more broadly addressing increasing labor force participation, for instance. But one can also think about increasing the share of the pie for social protection. And in a way, earmarking and tying, dedicating different revenues to social protection is a way of doing that, and I will be talking about that. So what you here see is simply spending levels, and I think that illustrates what we heard in the morning, that indeed in OECD countries the redistributive function of social protection and taxes and transfers is big, and the reason is because countries spend a lot. Of course, there's also the progressivity of how they spend, but spending levels are important. But I think you also see here that there's no high income model. Spending levels vary a lot. They were high already, however, on average before the pandemic. About half of government spending in OECD countries went to social protection. And on the right, you see that during the pandemic, it increased quite a bit. So again, that's the point I made earlier about fiscal pressures. Next slide, please. Also, we heard in the morning that there's, of course, Santiago Levy said, the important role of social insurance in rich countries. That's absolutely right. But again, if you drill down more, there's no one model. You see actually huge differences in terms of if you look at different population groups. Here we see transfers or income support received by the working age population. You see big differences in terms of the amount that they spend. So that partly reflects also the political will that Andrea mentioned. But perhaps equally importantly, you also see very different types of spending. You see very different composition in terms of contributory systems, insurance, social protection, means tested, targeted, and universal, including in countries actually where perhaps people think naturally, as this is very strongly social insurance oriented, such as the birth country of Bismarck in Germany. Actually, the other elements are very important for many population groups. And the reason I show this is that for different types of social protection, earmarking is more common or is more easily achieved. So earmarking in the sense of devoting resources through some sort of legal mechanisms to certain spending categories, including social protection. So for social insurance, almost by definition, this is earmarked. So social contribution confer entitlement, and social contributions are almost always, for obvious reasons, earmarked to finance the program that people become entitled to. For general tax revenues, the link is obviously weaker, simply because general tax revenues finance many other things than social protection. So just to give a broad overview, what I tried to do here is basically break down the amount that countries spend by the type of financing. So we see here social contributions in orange, and in blue we see general revenue financing, and some of this general revenue can be earmarked. So one takeaway from this slide is again that there's a lot of differences between countries, not only in terms of spending levels, but also in terms of the composition. Yes, social contributions are important, but actually there's quite a few OECD countries where general revenue financing is more important. Another takeaway is that earmarking outside of social contributions is relatively uncommon. So that's the dark blue element that you see here. You see a big chunk in France. You see a little bit in Austria, and in between in Belgium. But other than that, it's relatively small. So it'd be interesting to see what are the mechanisms behind this, what programs and what designs actually produce this kind of graph, and what can we learn also for maybe political dynamics. Next slide, please. And one of the dynamics is whether, and big question I think that has come to the fore more and more in maybe the past 1 or 2 decades, is whether contribution financing as such is sustainable. And population aging is one of the concerns there, the obvious concerns, but also new forms of work where it's easier for gig workers and others in non-standard employment to opt out, given the incentives that Santiago has mentioned this morning, to opt out of social insurance because it's more expensive, it creates higher labor costs, etc. And does that erode the whole system? Well, if it does, then social contributions should go down. And actually we see here that that's not the case. So over the past 20 years, actually, as a share of GDP, the contribution financing has increased slightly. There are some dynamics in between. Part of it is due to the labor share in national income, because obviously contributions are levied on labor income almost exclusively. And so when the labor share goes down, such as during the global financial crisis, then you see a big dip, but that has recovered since. So one cannot say that there's a general movement away from the most important type of earmarking in OECD countries. Next slide, please. So I will now go through some country examples to make this a little more concrete, talk about the programs and sort of the characteristics of that countries use for earmarking. So you see one set of examples here. So just to think about the social programs that are financed by earmarked social assistance financing, if you like, you see very different ones. So you see family benefits in Austria, you see Medicare at the bottom in the US, so that's the health program, the publicly provided health program for retired people and people receiving disability benefits. You see also a pension in Portugal, and you see disability and sort of care-related benefits in Poland. So across all different branches, we find examples of uses. They're sometimes small, but not always. So for family benefits, for instance, in Austria, there's a large universal program, as well as some other smaller programs that these earmarked funds finance, and that sums to about for 1.5% of GDP. One interesting thread that goes through these programs is that often there's a built-in mechanism where actually there's some progressivity. So those who typically have more income, richer people, they tend to pay more, and you see that also as a trend, if you like. So, for instance, in the U.S. Medicare case in 2010, there was an additional progressive element introduced, and in 2023, that was increased again for people with very high earnings. You see a similar mechanism in Poland for disability and care finance, and also in Portugal. Next slide, please. So I want to spend a little more time on the case of France, because it's interesting in a number of ways. One is, as I showed initially, that this is the country with, among the OECD countries, the biggest part of social assistance financing, of general revenue financing, coming from earmarked funds. And how did this come to pass? So actually, France is another interesting reason why it's interesting, is the country with the highest level of social spending in the OECD and the world. And much of the increase actually is due to aging, to some extent, to health and old age support in the past 10 to 15 years. So increasing needs basically for social protection, and that created tensions obviously in the system. Financing was actually, before that, up until the 1990s, mostly through contributions. But that changed quite a bit and became much more diversified since then, and now contributions account for about 60% of total spending. The way this happened is there were multiple rounds of reductions, specifically in contributions that are paid by employers. So that's the redistribution that was mentioned this morning from employers to workers, because of significant concerns over labor costs. So the way, for instance, to ensure continued wage growth at the bottom and facilitate wage growth at the bottom, including through higher minimum wages, was to reduce at the same time contributions for employers, so that labor costs didn't change so much, but workers had higher take-home pay. So that's good for workers and not bad for employers, but of course it costs money. And the question was, where does that money come from? So, and that one mechanism for that was the massive scaling up of what's called the generalized social contribution, or CSG. That sounds like a contribution, but it's actually an income tax. And that now corresponds to 2/3 of the general revenue in France. So it's an income tax, and therefore it applies to all incomes, not only labor incomes. So interesting thing is it applies to capital incomes also, or things like gambling that's mentioned here. But of course, because the labor share is high, in fact, most of the revenue de facto comes from labor income.
6 minutes.
What this finances, thank you. What this finances is solidarity benefits, whereas contributions finance contributory insurance benefits. Let me switch from France to just an example of a very different type of earmarking, and maybe looking more into the future. Next slide, please. So this is about carbon pricing. So thinking about an important challenge and an important trend that will also create additional needs for social support, significantly so, as we have heard today. And the question is, well, how can resources that are connected to the green transition, how could they be leveraged for social purposes? And one obvious revenue source is from carbon pricing. So that can be in the form of explicit carbon taxes, it can be in the form of excise duties, or it can be in the form of tradable sort of emission permissions. But what's common is that all of these types of carbon pricing bring revenue to the government. And a question arises, well, how can this be used, and how can social policy take a share in that in a way that actually facilitates the green transition? And the example that's shown here is some work we've done for one country, and we're doing for more now, is to actually look at the distributional impact of carbon pricing given people's consumption, who is paying for higher carbon prices, basically, which households. But looking also at the same time at the recycling of revenue. So if we get this, if government gets this additional revenue, if this is to some extent channeled back to households in a way that can be more or less targeted, can we actually make sure that disadvantaged households are protected to some extent? And can we also compensate people in a way that facilitates majority support for this necessary green transition agenda? And what we see here is that in fact the net effect, and that's shown by the blue bars, can be made quite progressive, even with a simple lump sum payment. It could be made even more progressive if that payment was targeted. And on the right-hand side, and that's the green line, we see the number of people actually gaining in net terms, being better off than without carbon pricing if the whole revenue is recycled. And so that's quite encouraging, because up to decile 8, let's say you have 7 or 8, you have more than half of people gaining. So actually you have majority support, and overall it's 60%, I think. Next slide, please.
3 minutes.
So here just some examples of this revenue recycling actually taking place. So for instance, Austria has introduced a carbon tax relatively recently, and has committed significant resources to compensate people in the form of a lump sum tax that distinguishes depending on where they live. So people who live in more rural area that has less public transport, for instance, and where they have less possibilities to shift away from carbon intensive lifestyles because they need their car basically, they get more than people who live in cities where the underground or the trains are next door. Switzerland is an early example. It was already introduced in 2011, but increased tenfold up until 2022. So that just illustrates the revenue potential that is there over the next number of decades if we're to meet net zero targets. And also Ireland is an interesting example, because there it's not sort of a legally binding type of earmarking, but more soft, if you like, earmarking. It's more political commitment to compensate people in need. So let me just finish with some thoughts on earmarking. Well, what are challenges? Is it actually useful, or is it problematic? Well, it depends partly depends who you ask. If you ask a finance minister, they will probably say, well, it reduces budgetary flexibility. We are against it. It also depends on when you ask. For instance, protecting essential spending can be particularly important during times of fiscal crunch. The question then arises, of course, what is essential? I think it's key to look at the objectives of the social program, and then also consider whether the way that it is financed, so the earmarked financing source, if you like, the earmarked tax, is in line with that objective. So does it complement the social program that it finances, or does it work against it? So for instance, if you look at equity objectives, then having a sort of a progressive way of financing the program increases overall redistribution, and that can be considered a good thing. If one thinks about incentives or prevention of disadvantage in the area of health, for instance, then financing health expenditures with health taxes or sin taxes, such as alcohol or tobacco, as happens in the Philippines, for instance, can be considered a good thing. But the key question, of course, is whether earmarked revenues are sufficient, and if they are in sync with the programs that they finance. So, do they enable counter-cyclical crisis support, for instance, or are they pro-cyclical? I think one, and that's my last point, one interesting consideration is whether earmarking is a long-term commitment or whether it's introduced as a transitional measure. I mentioned the case of the green transition. One can think of it as a political necessity in order to have people support the carbon pricing to compensate them and to make this link as visible as possible. That's not always easy, but that's an interesting mechanism to think about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Immoval. So it's very exciting to know about especially this carbon financing revenue on these social protection schemes. So maybe the audience would like to know more about, if this will be, through this lump sum allocation, would this be designed to be targeted or generally, like for people who are influenced by this green transition? Yeah. Okay, our next speaker is our expert based on country experience. Firstly, is Ms. Arya from Nepal. We all know that Nepal has been among the very few developing member countries whose government spends more than the 3.3% of their GDP on social assistance. And recently, they have very significant expansion of the social protection coverage. Let's hear from our Joint Secretary. Thank you. The time is 8 minutes.
Thank you so much. Namaste and very warm good afternoon from Nepal. First of all, I would like to request you all to send your good vibes, to close your eyes for 30 seconds for the better financial management as well as social protection. Thank you. Social protection is at the foremost of the development agenda in Nepal. The Constitution of 2015 is recognizing social security is a right to all citizens in Article 43, as well as a right to employment and right to labor. In addition to this, 15th National Development Plan sets the goal to make social security and protection sustainable, universal, and accessible for the implementation of civil rights and to strengthen the trust of citizens toward the state. The plan sets ambitious targets to achieve its goal, including covering 60% of the population with basic social protection schemes, and in the current fiscal year 2023-24, 4% budget out of GDP and 13.7% budget of the national budget for social protection is allocated. It's about $1.7 billion. While comparing last 5 years, social protection expenditure, it has been multiplied by 3.4 times and reached from 66 billion Nepali rupees in fiscal year 2019 20 to 224.4 billion in 2023 to 24. There are 87 programs that can be classified as social protection in Nepal, and these are being implemented by 13 ministries and agencies under them. Annual beneficiaries, eligibility in social security allowances are mostly old age people, 68 plus. Old age of specific deprived region, Karnali, single woman age, 60 plus, widowed woman with no earning members in the family, endangered ethnic tribe belonging to one of 10 ethnic groups, disability, full disability, partial disability, and Dalit deprived class, and child grants for 25 districts too. All children under 5 in 25 districts, employment-based program, Prime Minister's employment program is also launched, social caretaking, old age home, orphan home, and others. When observing protection against different risks in the life cycle or for specific groups, coverage varies significantly. Now, most older people, around 99% of 68 years old, have access to social security benefits. Similarly, social protection coverage of children is 65.7% when accounting for in-kind support. As per the most recent census, 2021, estimates there are nearly 3 million people aged 60 and above in Nepal. Roughly 10% of the population, of whom 1.25 billion are at least 70 years old. So there are challenges for Nepal to address social security program for a long. The first relates to the sustainability of the expenditure, and second is the managing data on real time, developing coordination among 3 tiers of government, as the 3 tiers of government are competing to declare social security program in isolation. Still, uncovering of all people is also another challenge. Unemployment and foreign employment, covering foreign employment is also another challenge. 3 million people are engaged for foreign employment and are not affiliated regularly in social protection fund. And next one, poverty.
Left.
So we have to work to address the challenges now. First of all, enabling human capacity to address the fiscal gap is most essential. We have a strategy to decrease the budget in 5% of GDP and 14% of total annual budget up to 2030 for long-term gains. And contributory system is another way to address the problem, financial gap. Anthony H. already has presented conditional cash transfer policy is also another alternate for us. And integrated social registration system is essential as all the programs and budget are scattered. To cover foreign employee, government has been working to integrate foreign employee in National Social Security Fund on regular basis. Umbrella concept of social protection for scattered program is required, and last but not least, most essential, R&D for social protection is urgent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are very happy to see that 99% of 6 to 8 years children have the access to the cash-based social protection coverage. And we know that the government is working forward to coming up with more coverage for the people in the working age, especially those in the informal economy and self-employed. Now, let's welcome Ms. Sachani from Australia ACE with her experience in the Pacific countries and Timor-Leste. Your time is also 8 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll try to bring in some Pacific examples here. It's working in the Pacific, you know that not everybody is familiar with the Pacific Island countries. So hopefully with this study that we've been doing, there's a bit more understanding and a bit more familiarity with the Pacific Island countries. So very quick introduction. This work that we did in a team consisting of social protection specialists and public finance management specialists is under the Partnership for Social Protection. It's an Australian government-supported programs focusing on strengthening social protection in Pacific Island countries and Timor-Leste. And the objectives of the study was mainly one, to support analysis on financing for social protection by providing the size and composition of social protection expenditure throughout Pacific Island countries and Timor-Leste. Also looking at the historical evolution of social protection expenditure, how it has changed over time. And this is something that we find important as a reference for future pathways, because we know what has worked and we know what has not worked by looking at how things were done before. And the last that I want to discuss here is that we wanted to bring in alignment between social protection classification and the measures used for measuring government expenditure, because early on in this study, when we were working in a team of the different sectors, let's say PFM and social protection, there was this sort of frustration where the PFM people don't really get why social protection is defined a certain way, and it's different from how we look at government expenditure. So there's a mismatch, and the problem with that is that there is often an overlap with other sectors, and we look at sectors such as education and health, where social protection analysis often include these expenditures, whereas in the public finance management system, it is not the case. So we use government finance statistics framework, which is consistently routinely used by Ministry of Finance, and this is a way that we find that alignment. But the effect of it is that it may, change or exclude some of the items that we normally consider social protection. So without getting into the details, we use economic classification, where social benefits is clearly stated in government budgets normally, and with the functional classification, there's social protection as a standalone sub-classification. So we kind of put those two within the brackets of social protection. And this is all in the IMF Government Financial Statistics Manual of 2014, so it's all kind of clearly defined there. So one of the things that may be, which requires further discussion, is that within this classification, Provident Fund is not included. And there are also other reasons why it's kind of a different, it goes into a different group in the social protection that we're talking about here. I'll get into it a little bit more. So we focus on some countries. although also recognizing that countries like Cook Islands and Tokelau, not in the study, they have done very well in terms of having comprehensive social protection systems. So looking at the expenditure, we see that there is a big variety, which is also not something immediately everybody recognized, because there's an assumption in the beginning earlier on that Pacific Island countries are kind of similar in their systems. But we see that you have Kiribati and Timor-Leste with higher expenditure, and then you have the countries in the middle, and Solomon Islands, PNG, Vanuatu. In this parameters do not have notable social protection expenditure. And we put percent of GNI here because of the specific context where some revenues such as oil or fishing licenses are not included in GDP, which is quite a different context compared to the other countries. And again, we need a different discussion on why Provident Fund is not included, partly because it's kind of here it's a partial social protection, as they do not fully incorporate features of social protection such as risk pooling. Not to say that it's not important or that it's not a big part of the economy. So by function, we see that what's striking is that the dominant scheme is universal life cycle schemes. One and the biggest is social pension, universal social pension or near universal social pension. And that's in all the 7 countries that has social protection expenditure. Universal disability benefit is also present in all 7 countries. Means tested benefit only exists in 2 countries, and it's very, very small in terms of expenditure. So it stands in contrast with the rest of Asia, lower middle income Asia Pacific, where the dominant is either poverty targeted programs or benefits for civil servants. So there needs to be further studies looking into why universal social protection is popular and working very well, expanded very smoothly. One being possibly the simplicity of the mechanism given the complex geography of the region. So looking at the timeline of introduction, we see that social protection is not new in the Pacific. It did start mainly with Provident Fund, but the last 2 decades, social assistance have been expanding very strongly. And again, this is driven by universal pension and universal disability benefit. And we also recognize here that the child focus schemes are lacking. So this is the gap that is very noticeable in the region. And the way the social assistance have expanded is mainly gradual. I have just 2 country examples, sorry. Mainly gradual through reduction of age of eligibility for social pension, for instance. You start with 70 plus age, and then you reduce it to 65, some all the way to 60. So that way, the budget increases gradually, and the other way is incremental increases in benefit level. You start very small, and then as the program becomes more popular, it expands, or differential benefits for different categories of beneficiaries, for instance, for people with severe disabilities and other types of disabilities. So just quickly on the examples, this is from Fiji. You see that there is a big increase over time in the expenditure, and this is mainly driven by the expansion of old age pension as well as a introduction and gradual expansion of disability benefit. And there was no kind of shock, noticeable shock in the economy or in community responses. And this has gone relatively smoothly. We have a different, next please. A different picture.
Half a minute.
Just the last one. We have a different picture from Kiribati where it's a rapid expansion of programs in the last 3-4 years. But also at the same time, we did not see or we did not hear, in Kiribati, there's like a big shock in the economy, in communities. These are different ways of expanding social protection expenditure. But for sure, Kiribati is not the norm. So Fiji is more where countries are heading towards. So last one is just the key takeaways. And I want to also give you some links to the study as well as the database that will be updated over time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sinta. Our session has been very, very intensive. I would have liked to, reserve, just for one golden question, but I really doubt that. So if possible, our audience is highly welcome, after the session, if you may have specific questions, to reach our resource persons and experts. Here, let's welcome our DG Bruno to share the ADB's readiness on the way forward to support their social protection. Mr. Bruno.
So thank you very much, Shinlong. Thank you to all the presenters and to the respondents. It has been a very exciting, insightful session. I don't pretend to conclude in a very thorough manner, but just wanted to pick up on some key messages and try as much as possible to link it to some of the work that we do at ADB. So Andrea from UNICEF started by giving us a dismal statistic, which is that child poverty is increasing for the first time in 30 years. As an institution, the Asian Development Bank, that has a mandate of poverty alleviation, it reminds us that we still have a lot of work to be done. He did introduce the importance of demographics and how we're seeing interesting demographics across many of our countries. We have countries in Asia and the Pacific that have a very young share of the population and others that are aging and aging fast. Thailand, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam are examples of countries that are aging fast. And what's happening is that in contrast to what happened in Japan, these countries are getting old before they get richer. And that, of course, puts on tremendous pressure on the public finances and on the spending. And it ends up becoming, in many instances, a fiscal problem. We do recognize that social protection is essential in terms of being able to strengthen and enhance the welfare of people. But we also recognize that social protection is largely government financed. And as such, Andrea presented a list of important considerations, including the efficiency of public financial management, and something that we at ADB are very strongly sponsoring and supporting, domestic resource mobilization. In the Asia-Pacific economies, domestic resource mobilization, and in particular tax yields, roughly amount to 17% of GDP against OECD rates that are along the 24-25% on average. So there you have an example of how, to the extent that we have more ability to finance social protection, we will be able to do a better job. There was also a very important consideration in terms of how countries face shocks, and of course the COVID-19 shock was an example where it made tremendous strength and effort to use that public spending as a counter-cyclical support buffer. The Asian Development Bank contributed as part of a very big support program, the counter-cyclical support facility, to help particularly those countries in being able to use increasing spending with the understanding that it would be very important in terms of holding, being able to keep companies afloat, being able to make sure that unemployment did not go even further down. And of course, the importance here it hasn't been mentioned in some ways. We have had examples of long-term budgeting, but the idea of a balanced budget over the cycle is something that at ADB we certainly support. But in the end, as Andrea mentioned, fiscal space is a political choice, and it is part of policy prioritization. Turning quickly to Hedwig from OECD, he did bring out a very important consideration, which is all about earmarking and how we can look at means to be able to finance from a payroll the spending that can be supported in a more balanced manner. There is a very important consideration in terms of redistribution through tax and spending, and he brought out very clear examples across the OECD countries where social protection accounted in I think it was 19, for approximately 1/2 of pre-pandemic government spending. Again, makes a lot of sense, but based on a higher revenue share. It is also important that we look at earmarking, and here he broke down financing across the general revenue, where you can break that down further between earmarked, which is generally small proportion in OECD countries, and non-earmarked. And of course, the other one was just the social insurance contributions. Quickly, he did make a very important point, and as a climate bank, I appreciate that he brought out the importance of growing carbon pricing revenues as a way to redistribute revenues. It is important for countries to recognize that we need to price emissions. You cannot pollute and get away with it. There is a social cost, and it is important to recognize that that is a very important instrument to redistribute, in many instances, to lower income households. We also want to recognize, like the sin taxes, being able to introduce carbon pricing can also have other benefits, including reducing future health costs. So a very important consideration here. He did talk again about earmarking as a means to provide greater budgetary flexibility, but recognizing the importance of sunset clauses and also the importance of earmarking as a transitional measure. Turning to the respondents, we had a very interesting set of results that the Joint Secretary from Nepal presented, where she described how the 2015 Constitution did recognize the importance of social security as a right for all citizens. The coverage so far is 60% of the population, and it accounts for approximately 4% of GDP, roughly on the higher edge of what we saw across the Pacific Island economies, and 13.7% of the budget. 87 programs have been implemented by 13 ministries. And she presented some challenges, including the sustainability of expenditures, managing data, which I think is a challenge for many of our countries, and of course, coordination amongst the 3 tiers of government. Finally, Satriana discussed the Pacific Islands and Timor-Leste in more detail, brought out some important analysis. The alignment of economic and functional classifications means to try to avoid overlaps in spending. And of course, she also brought out the importance of framing it into a medium-term budget framework. Social protection expenditures varies. She gave examples from Tuvalu at 0.4% to Kiribati at 4.1% on the higher end. This also overshadowed the fact that in many Pacific Islands, the provident funds are large contributors to social protection financing. I think with those very brief points, I wanted again to give a big thanks to Mr. Andrea Rossi from UNICEF, Mr. Hedwig Immervoll from OECD, Joint Secretary Ms. Parvati Aryal from Nepal, and Ms. Sintra Satriana from the Social Protection Partnership for Social Protection. Many, many thanks. I really enjoyed this. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, DG Bruno. Your note is very, very encouraging. And as ADB practitioner on social protection, we will follow what you guided. And so let's have, again, great applause for our experts here, including our DG Bruno. Thank you. Thank you for your attention and time. Thank you.